Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, Episode 33, The History of Canada. So we have three drinks for today's drink of choice. Lots of variety. There is the very famous Royal Crown Whiskey, probably the most famous drink from Canada, made to celebrate King George's visit to Canada in 1939. It's a whiskey, and that's all I can really say on it. It's not terrible, but also not spectacular. Next we have Le Fin du Monde, a Belgian-style beer from Quebec that is actually really good, light, and easy to drink. And finally, we have Pendleton Whiskey, which I really liked. It's very smooth, almost creamy, just overall a good whiskey. Also, while it is a Canadian whiskey and is distilled in Canada, the company is largely based and sold in Pendleton, Oregon, and was created to celebrate the cowboy roundup in the town. While I admittedly got these three drinks because they look cool, I'd like to pretend I actually got them because they symbolize three important historical trends in Canada: the British and loyalty to the mother country, Quebec and the French Canadians, and the Americans, who, as much as the Canadians hate to admit it, greatly shaped Canada's identity. But before we talk about Canada, I feel the need to just say up front, I'm not going to touch up on every important event in Canadian history. I will try my best to at least mention most of the major events and processes in Canadian history, but I am sure I will miss something. I, with this episode and all the episodes in this series, am summarizing the history of the place, and not giving a fully detailed history. So yeah, sorry if I missed something you were super interested in, or just quickly go over it. I'll briefly just give three really useful sources I found in case you want to learn more. There's a book called A Concise History of Canada by Margaret Conard, which is almost 300 pages of Canadian history. There's the documentary series A People's History of Canada, which is a 18-part documentary. You can find all but one of the episodes on YouTube for free, although the audio was a little off at parts. And then finally, while he doesn't exclusively talk about history, or even Canada, JJ McCullough has a YouTube channel where he talks about Canadian history and politics pretty frequently, and he has some pretty good videos on things we will touch up on in the video. But again, before we begin to talk about Canadian history, let's set the stage. Canada is located in northern North America. It has the Atlantic Ocean to the east, the United States to the south, the Pacific Ocean to the west, the American state of Alaska to the northwest, and the Arctic Ocean to the north. It also technically, due to the small, uninhabited Hans Island, shares a border with Greenland and, therefore, Denmark. Canada is often stereotyped as a place that just snows all the time. While this isn't true, Canada is still a very cold place. The Canadian Arctic is extremely cold and often frozen year-round. But if you go south, especially along the Pacific coast and southwestern Ontario, it can actually get pretty warm. Canada is also mostly forested, although there are some plains in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Canada is a federation, being divided between 10 provinces and 3 territories. There's relatively little difference between the territories and the provinces, except the territories are located in the north, have a very small population, have less representation in the Canadian Senate, and also have a larger Indigenous population proportionally than the rest of the country. Canada has around 38 million people in the country, mostly found in the south, and particularly in southern Ontario and Quebec. I'd argue there's 3 main racial classifications in Canada. First off, there is those of European descent, who make up over 70% of the country. Most white people in Canada can trace their origins to France, England, or other parts of the British Isles, like Ireland or Scotland. However, there also are large numbers of Germans, Ukrainians, Italians, Dutch, Polish, and Russian Canadians. Canada also has a decently sized Indigenous population, with around 5% of the country identifying as Indigenous. There are the First Nations, who are a variety of different tribes and native Canadian nations primarily found in the south. There are the Métis people, who are people of mixed Indigenous and European heritage. And then finally, in the far north, there are the Inuit. Finally, the remaining population is considered visible minorities, which include a wide variety of people, including Black, Chinese, Indian, Japanese, and Filipino Canadians. Overall, Canada today is quite diverse and with many different people groups. While race and ethnic origin is certainly important in Canadian history and culture, perhaps a more important divider is language. Canada is an officially bilingual state, with English and French being the 2 main languages. Canada is often stereotyped as having all the French speakers in Quebec, New Brunswick being divided between French and English speakers, and then everywhere else speaking English. However, it's important to note Quebec has a decently sized Anglophone-speaking community, and Francophone-speaking groups are found throughout Canada, but particularly in Ontario and Manitoba. While the country is officially bilingual, less than 20% can actually speak both languages. As you will find out throughout the episode, Francophone and Anglophone Canadians often are frequently combative towards each other. Some Indigenous peoples will speak their own languages, but less than 1% speak these languages regularly, although none of it does have an Inuit-speaking majority. And then finally, you can also find many people, particularly visible minorities or close-knit white ethnic groups, who sometimes speak their own language, with Chinese being the most spoken non-official language. Finally, religion-wise, Canada is majority Christian. Around half of all Christians are Catholic, with Catholicism particularly strong among French Canadians. Protestantism is also quite popular, with United Church of Canada being the largest Protestant group. There also are smaller groups of Orthodox Christians, along with various non-Christian religions such as Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, and Judaism. Finally, Canada, especially in the West, has a very large non-religious population, with almost 25% holding no real religious beliefs, and even many religious people tend to have a very secular outlook. So let's start talking about Canadian history and hope it takes less than 12 pages. Canada was first settled by the people of the First Nations, hence the name. These first peoples of Canada were spread throughout the country and were divided between many different nations, cultures, and tribes. As just a brief snapshot of the different people groups you saw in Canada, there were the many different societies around the wider Salish Sea, with their large villages, slave societies, potlucks, and unique art. Then, around the Great Lakes, you had the various Algonquin-speaking peoples who practiced agriculture, growing the Three Sisters, squash, beans, and corn, while also frequently in conflict with the Iroquois Confederacy or the Haudenosaunee south of them. Algonquin peoples were actually probably the most numerous in pre-colonial Canada, stretching from the Rocky Mountains in the west to the Atlantic Ocean in the east. And then finally, I'll just mention the Beothuk, the indigenous people of Newfoundland, who were hunter-gatherers. Starting roughly around 1000 CE, the ancestors of the Inuit began moving into northern Alaska, into the Canadian North, displacing the Tuna people living there. The Inuit would eventually spread out throughout the Arctic, with various Inuit people controlling the Canadian Arctic, the area around the northern Hudson Bay, northern Quebec, and even making it to Greenland. The Inuit were hunter-gatherers, noted for their extreme living conditions, egalitarian society, use of the kayak, impressive cosmology, and for some Inuit, seasonal living in igloos. There are several theories and stories of people before Columbus visiting the Americas. Some of these theories are possible, others are a bit far-fetched, and others are straight-up pseudoscience. However, the only accepted case occurred in Canada, with the Vikings landing and briefly settling in northern Newfoundland. The Viking base at L'Anse aux Meadows was believed to have been founded in the 11th century. However, while the Norse settlement is fascinating, it lasted only around 20 years, and mostly had a marginal impact on wider Canadian history, so I won't focus on it too much. The next time Europeans would settle in Canada would occur in the 16th century. Technically, almost all of the New World was supposed to belong to Spain under the Treaty of Tordesillas. However, this was ignored as other European powers sought to get a hold of the riches in the New World. At first, Europeans would arrive off the coast of eastern Canada, fishing in the bountiful waters where it's said they could just put a bucket in the water and have it immediately fill up with fish. Many temporary settlements were established, but it wouldn't be until 1541 that the first long-term settlements were set up by the French. New France, as the French colony was called, was for most of its early history sparsely populated by Europeans. Most of the settlement was based around the St. Lawrence River Valley, in what is now southern Quebec and the region of Acadia or modern-day Nova Scotia. Most of the colony's population was fishermen, who were often only seasonally in the colony, soldiers and administrators, explorers, or fur trappers, with very few European women in the colony. The fur trade would eventually grow to become the main economic export of the colony. Fur from beavers is waterproof, which made them very practical, and European fashion at the time held beaver fur in high regard. Many Europeans were able to make a lot of money from trading furs, and many would travel deep into the continent in search of beavers to trap and sell. These fur trappers, or coureurs de bois, would often rely on help from native peoples they encountered. New France would overall try to cultivate friendly relations with the natives they encountered. In 1609, Samuel de Champlain, often referred to as the father of Quebec, with France's Algonquin allies, defeated a Haudenosaunee war party. After this battle, France would trade with its native allies guns, iron, and weapons to do war with the Haudenosaunee, who were supplied by France's rivals, England and the Dutch. France would attempt to convert their friendly tribes to Catholicism, to both spread the word of God and to also solidify the alliance between France and the native peoples. However, many of the missionaries that came to these tribes brought disease, killing off large numbers of natives and weakening them in the face of continued Haudenosaunee raids. The native population in Canada starting in the 1600s began to decline as disease, and new European guns and alcohol began to kill off large segments of their population. In the 1660s, France was beginning to notice more and more just how small New France was population-wise. New France, having only 1,000 or so people, was tiny compared to the English colonies being founded in the south that had close to 100,000 people in them. France decided to send more settlers into the region, notably the filles du roi, or king's daughters, who were poor women/girls taken off the streets and sent to the New World. The experience of these settlers was mixed, with some trying to leave as soon as they could. However, others found that if they toughed it out, they could experience better living conditions than they could in Europe. Farming, shipbuilding, and some manufacturing began to take root in the colony, although fur still remained the main staple of the colony. New France by 1700 would have around 15,000 people, and by 1760 they had around 70,000. But New France was still smaller than its English neighbors, who continued to grow more and more, and moved north into French territory. New France, and especially settlements on the outskirts of its French territory, would face raids from the Haudenosaunee warriors and English militias. While France and its allies would and did return the favor to outlying English settlements, they still suffered. In 1713, France lost Acadia to the English. However, New France would ultimately fall at the end of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, fought from 1754 to 1763. The war would at first start off very well for the French and their native allies, as English troops were crushed in several important battles, most famously the Battle of Braddock's Field. However, French forces were divided between the local Canadian militia and the French military officers, who wished for two very different types of war and bickered with each other. France's allegiance to the native Canadians also proved to be very costly. The French essentially bribed their native allies with European goods, which was a costly affair in the long term. When Britain was able to blockade New France and prevent any new supplies from reaching it, many natives simply abandoned the French. The decisive battle of the war, and debatably the most important event in Canadian history, would occur at the Plains of Abraham, where an English army defeated a French army outside Quebec City, capturing it. While fighting didn't end after the battle, it was the death blow to New France, and in 1763, all of New France was ceded to Britain. Also important to note, the vast majority of French Acadians, over 10,000 in all, during the war were forced out of the colony due to British concerns about the loyalty of the Acadians. Many of the French settlers were upset to be under British rule, yet, strangely, French settlers would end up siding with the British in the American Revolution and defeat the American Revolutionaries in the 1775 American attempt to take Canada. While it might seem like the American Patriots and the French Quebecois would be natural allies, it's also important to remember that the Americans were largely Protestant, while Quebec was Catholic. Quebecers feared that if the American Patriots took Quebec, they would be forced to become Protestant and lose their French language. While there would be a pro-independence Canadian force that fought with the Americans, most Quebecers decided to support Britain, who at least allowed the French some autonomy. After the American Revolution, many of those who opposed the revolution in the 13 colonies, known as Loyalists, fled north into Canada. Around 100,000 people fled into Canada, largely settling either on the Atlantic coast or what is now southeastern Ontario. These people, along with the new immigrants from either the British Isles or Germany, would form the basis of the Anglophone population Canada has today. Also important to note that while many of the new immigrants were white, a decent number of indigenous peoples also followed them, particularly from tribes and nations that fought with the British. There also would be a large number of black slaves who fought with the British and fled into Canada, where they were granted their freedom. While there had been a small black slave population in Quebec, this new wave of immigrants would help form the nucleus of the black population found in Canada today. Canada wouldn't escape conflict with the States, however. In 1812, the US declared war on Britain, and one of its goals was to take Canada. America would launch several attempted invasions into Canada, and while they would win a couple battles, they ultimately failed each time, partially due to poorly trained American militia, and the incorrect belief among the Americans that Canada would fight with them. By war's end, America had completely failed to take Canada, and the borders between British Canada and America remained unchanged. However, the war would importantly create one of the biggest driving factors in Canadian history and in Canadian politics, anti-Americanism. Canada after the war often saw itself as the antithesis of America. While America had its rowdy and unruly republicanism, Canada would embrace loyalty to tradition and order. Respect towards British institutions was paramount. While this dogmatic loyalty to order, tradition, and Britain would mostly disappear over time, there is still a very clear anti-American tilt many Canadian politicians embrace. Political opponents will often get branded pro-American or be accused of wanting Canada to be annexed into America by their rivals. This loyalty to traditional institutions allowed Canadian political elites to consolidate their power. In both Upper, Ontario, and Lower Canada, Quebec, wealthy elites managed to grow rich and effectively silence and crush political dissent. This led to a lot of discontent. In Lower Canada, Patriots and the Upper Canadian Hunter Lodges at first fielded candidates against the government, then tried open rebellion in 1837, even proclaiming their own republics for a brief moment. However, these rebellions would be crushed by well-trained British troops. The British administrators who sought to find the root cause of the rebellion and put an end to that came to the conclusion that the rebellions were the fault of an unfair system and decided to give greater rights and liberties to their Canadian colonies, along with merging Lower and Upper Canada together. The next couple decades would see Liberals and Conservatives fight over Canadian political institutions, with Reformers often coming out on top and implementing suffrage for all white men and land reform. The rebellions of 1837 are a bit debated in wider Canadian history. There are debates on if the rebels were pro-American annexationists, if the Lower Canadian Rebellion was a nationalist or liberal uprising, and if the rebellions were even important/effective in helping implement political reform. The rebellions overall are a quite interesting point in Canadian history. I've spent a lot of time in the East, so I'll throw a bone to Western Canada. More and more white settlers, particularly Anglophones, began moving west, hoping to both gain land and also strike it rich, with gold rushes in what are now British Columbia and the Yukon. British Columbia in particular would become more and more populated by Canadian settlers, as cities like Victoria sprung up. The West Coast would also see the start of Canada's Asian community, as Chinese, Japanese, and Indians all began moving into the region searching for work, although they had to deal with more and more anti-Asian laws as time went by. Settlers in Manitoba, meanwhile, found themselves in conflict with the descendants of the Coeur de Bois, fur trappers, and/or indigenous peoples, the Métis, who often spoke French and were Catholic. Tension was centered around what is now Winnipeg, as land disputes became more and more common. Did you enjoy that look at the West? Well, too bad, we're going back east. Canadians began experiencing greater political freedoms, and by the 1850s, Canadians were beginning to talk about a great transcontinental nation. They hoped to unite all the British territory in North America under a single government, believing this would help the economy of the colonies, protect it from the United States, and for French Canadians, give them some autonomy from the Anglophones. In 1867, the Canadian Confederation, which was actually a federation, with the provinces of Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick being the first to join. Quickly, other British colonies joined them, and by 1873, all of British-controlled Canada was under this new Canadian Confederation. This confederation, besides uniting all the colonies together, also gave it more autonomy from Britain, although still with the British monarchy as the head of state and under British foreign policy. The start of the Canadian Confederation would also be the start of many of Canada's political institutions that are still present today. Now, I wasn't actually correct when I said all of British Canada was a part of this new confederation. The British colony of Newfoundland wouldn't join at first and remained its own colony of Britain for almost a century after Confederation. When Confederation was being planned, it at first wasn't super popular in the maritime provinces, since these provinces had a very strong fishing economy and felt they would just be giving power away. However, their economies beginning to take a hit in the mid-1860s, the Catholic Church coming out fervently in support of Confederation, Irish nationalists attempting to invade Canada, don't question it, and just straight-up money being sent to political elites all prompted the Maritimes to join Canada. Newfoundland, though, never suffered through an economic downturn and remained strong economically. They would remain their own colony until, spoiler alert, The Great Depression destroyed its economy and would join with Canada in 1949, after it voted to join Canada in a referendum. This new Canadian Confederation would see many new people enter into Canada. As stated previously, many Asians were entering into Canada, mostly settling in the West, and later on in Ontario. Many new immigrants would also come from Europe. While previous immigrants had come from almost exclusively the British Isles and America, this new wave of immigrants came more so from Eastern and Southern Europe. In particular, many Ukrainians, Baltic peoples, and Italians all made their way into the Canadian prairies, hoping to carve out some farmland for themselves. Canada would go from a little over 3 million at the start of Confederation to over 8 million just 50 years later. Important to note that many of these new immigrants would become Anglophone, due to efforts by the English to Canadianize and assimilate these new migrants, which helped ensure Canada would be a majority Anglophone-speaking country. Many new migrants that settled in Manitoba would experience conflict with the already established Métis people. Land and fear of their way of life being destroyed led the Métis people to revolt in the Red River Rebellion in 1869. While only one person was killed, the Métis provisional government was disbanded, and the Métis leader, Louis Riel, fled the country. It still ended with the Métis allowed to establish their own province of Manitoba and some semblance of protection for their rights. However, a second rebellion led by Riel would take place in 1885 in Saskatchewan. Riel is a really fascinating figure, and I'm skipping over through a lot of important details, but essentially, Riel went off the deep end towards the end of his life and began preaching an almost apocalyptic vision of the Métis people forming their own Catholic superstate, which just ended up alienating a lot of people, particularly the native peoples who the Métis were supposed to work with. The rebellion would end with Riel being hanged, and ultimately all of the Canadian West would fall under government control. The Indigenous people of Canada overall lost more and more of their rights during this time. Some, like the Beothuk, were entirely wiped out. For many years now, Indigenous people, due to disease, unfair treaties, and white settlement, began being pushed more and more off their land, and their population shrank. Many Native groups were forced onto reserves, where they were under de facto control of white bureaucrats who segregated them and tried to stamp out their culture. Indigenous children were often put in residential schools, which sought to assimilate the children into white society, forcing them to no longer speak their native language and break any ties they had with their native past, under the threat of beatings. The residential school system lasted until the 1990s, and it's believed several thousand children were killed inside of it. Finally, before we begin talking about foreign policy, I'll just briefly talk a bit about the economy and society. The fur trade had largely died down by the start of the 20th century, and timber, wheat, fish, coal, and distilling all became some of the main economic driving factors. Railroads began to be built that ran from east to west, connecting the country together and helping increase development. Industrialization began, and many started to work in factories in urban areas, which was often in poor working conditions. Partially as a response to this, the progressive movement began springing up, arguing for prohibition, cleaner cities, government reform, and women's suffrage, very similar to the progressive movement in America. Canada politically was divided between the Liberal and Conservative Party, which embraced, unsurprisingly, liberal and conservative politics. These two parties would dominate Canadian politics pretty much up until today. Canada was also divided politically by its Anglophone and Francophone populations. Tension had existed for a while, with tension over the role of the Protestant and Catholic churches, the language of schools, and the prominence of their communities in government. However, the Second Boer War would also drive a wedge between the communities on foreign policy. The Second Boer War, to make a long story short, was a war between the British and the Boer communities in South Africa. For Anglo-Canadians, they felt Canada should go to war with the mother country and fight for imperial pride. However, French Canadians didn't feel like Canada had any business fighting in a conflict that they felt they didn't belong in. The Canadian government tried to compromise by having Canada send an all-volunteer force to fight the Boers, which ended by leading the government to be criticized as both too imperialist and not imperialist enough. The question on if Canada's foreign policy should be tied to Britain didn't go away when World War I was declared in 1914. Again, an all-volunteer force was sent to the Western Front. Canadian troops fought at several important battles, with Canadian soldiers often noted for their bravery and effectiveness. But this is World War I, so being brave and effective often meant high casualty rates. Infamously, Newfoundland would lose 90% of one of its regiments attempting to take a small French village in 1916. However, Canadian forces still managed to win victories at Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele. Canadian forces also fought in the Battle of the Atlantic, Gallipoli, and the skies above Western Europe. Also, didn't know where to put this, but apparently 1/3 of all able-bodied native men volunteered in the war. Most of the men that volunteered would be white Anglophone Protestants, with relatively few French Catholics. Francophones tended to view the army as by and for Protestants, and just generally difficult to operate in, since English was a language that the majority of officers would speak. While some French speakers did volunteer, similar to the Second Boer War, many Francophones felt the war wasn't Canada's business. With casualties mounting, the Canadian government decided to implement conscription for men over 20 years old. This led to protests and riots in Quebec as soldiers and French speakers clashed. This further divided Francophone and Anglophone Canada from each other. After the war, Canada would enter a period of instability. Many Canadians after the war began to embrace progressive ideas, and felt that the government, which had spent so much in war, should be able to spend on its people in peacetime. Unions went on strike, which resulted in clashes with the police. Left-wing parties began to emerge on the scene, advocating for workers' rights and greater relief to farmers. In the 1921 election, the Progressive Party, a mostly Western-based party, managed to win 21% of the vote. However, it died out just 10 years later. Several Marxist outfits were formed, although they remained pretty small and mostly to the fringe of Canadian politics. The longest-lasting political outfit would be the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, and its successor party, the New Democratic Party, or NDP. The NDP and its predecessor have served as a left-wing, sorta progressive, sorta socialist opposition towards the two larger liberal and conservative parties. Admittedly, the party is also sorta marginal, having never formed a federal government. But its leader did play a role in building up the modern Canadian welfare state, and at the provincial level in certain provinces, particularly western ones, have been quite powerful. Left forces would grow largely due to the Great Depression, which forced many into unemployment and poverty. As almost 1/4 of all Canadians lost their jobs, many turned to new and radical ideas for answers. Many would join left-wing outfits, but others found answers in different ideologies. Canada would see several fascist organizations emerge in the 30s, but quite frankly, they weren't really important or powerful and are a footnote at best. More widespread movements would include the social credit movement, a populist movement that argued for monetary reform. I'm not going to go any deeper because, quite frankly, we don't have time, but it would dominate politics in Alberta and British Columbia for several decades. And then finally, in Quebec, you would see the Union Nationale form that would dominate Quebec politics from the 30s to the 60s. It embraced a very traditional Catholic vision for Quebec that would greatly shape Quebec's development and politics. Despite a 1931 act that gave Canada more autonomy in foreign policy, Canada still went to war with Britain in World War II. Canada's role at first was largely just to provide supplies to Britain and help Britain fight off German raids in the skies and in the Atlantic. However, after the start of the Italian campaign, Canadian forces would begin fighting there, along with taking part in the Normandy landings and the Western Front. Overall, over 1 million Canadians would serve in the armed forces, and Canada post-war would see it emerge as a player on the world stage. Canada at home would see important changes. Women began to see greater involvement in wider society, as more and more women took up jobs to help sustain the war effort. Most women had the right to vote in Canada by the 1930s, but in 1940, all white women would be able to vote after Quebec passed universal suffrage. There also would be another conscription crisis in Quebec. However, due to the Canadian military making a greater effort to create all French-speaking units, the crisis was minor when compared to the 1917 crisis. But the Canadian government didn't make too much of an effort to reach out to Japanese Canadians, who they decided to intern for several years. Canada's economy also grew as the government invested more and more into industry and gave jobs to many of the unemployed in Canada. Canada post-war would see the government continue to invest more and more in the economy. The Conservatives at the time actually changed their name to the Progressive Conservatives for a couple decades, to show the public that they were willing to support a welfare state and protect social security. While Canadian politics had been very radical in the 30s, after the war they had really moderated. The NDP and the Conservatives both moved closer to the Liberals ideologically. The post-war era also saw Canadians move more and more into cities and suburbs to find jobs. Manufacturing jobs, along with blue-collar jobs, became more and more apparent, while oil and uranium grew as important exports. Canada found itself post-war drifting more and more in the American orbit. Some of this was just simply Canada grew closer to America on a geopolitical level. So Canada joined NATO and fought with the Americans in Korea and then later on in the Gulf War, Afghanistan, and Libya. But Canada also culturally grew closer with the US. Since the 20s and the advent of mass media, Canadian culture began to resemble more and more American culture. American radio shows, music, and movies all would become popular in Canada, while Canadian artists would also alternatively grow their own audience in the States. While there are many people today in Canada who don't really care where their entertainment or style or art comes from, there has been a bit of backlash against this growing Americanization. Since the 1940s, the Canadian government has sought to promote Canadian entertainment in hopes of preventing further Americanization. Agencies like the CRTC serve to ensure a certain amount of shows on TV or songs on the radio are from Canada itself. Whether this has actually helped protect Canadian identity is very much up for debate. Quebec's identity would start to change in the 60s. After decades of conservative Catholic rule, Quebecers, particularly urban and young Quebecers, removed the Union Nationale from power and embraced secularization in what became known as the Quiet Revolution. The revolution did also birth the Quebec independence movement. While there had been proto-nationalists since the early 1800s, the Quiet Revolution led many Quebecers to challenge traditional institutions and led them more and more to challenge the dominance of Anglophones in Canadian politics, society, and industry. Political parties like the Parti Québécois emerged, arguing for Quebec independence and began contesting elections. Other groups like the FLQ also argued for independence, but took to more violent methods. The FLQ would infamously kidnap and kill the Deputy Premier of Quebec in 1970, which would trigger martial law across Canada. Today, Quebec nationalism is very much alive and well, although after two failed independence referendums at the end of the century, Quebec nationalists are less focused on pushing for outright independence and are fighting more for autonomy from the rest of Canada. Quebec nationalists weren't the only ones fighting against the status quo. Feminist organizations rose up to protest male dominance in society, environmentalists protested environmental degradation, anti-war movements protested America's involvement in Vietnam, and as many non-white people began to move into the country due to the removal of exclusionary immigration laws, anti-racist groups also emerged protesting racism in Canadian society. Probably one of the most influential of the various new left movements that sprung up would be the Indigenous rights movement. Indigenous peoples throughout Canada began demanding greater autonomy, with Native Canadians receiving the right to vote in the 60s, and some land disputes began being resolved in the Native people's favor. However, you will still find many activists arguing the Canadian government hasn't gone far enough to grant Indigenous people autonomy and justice. Indigenous rights activists, along with other social movements, continue to push for social justice, but more and more there is increased dissatisfaction in these movements with the rate of change. Now, some may have noted that I never outright said, X year is when Canada got its independence. In 1982, Canada officially got its own constitution and gave itself full sovereignty from Britain. So, was 1982 the year Canada became independent? Well, while there was change in how Canada operated, it was more or less the same. Canadian political elites pretty much had as much power at the start of 1982 as they would in 1983. When Canada really became its own country doesn't really have a good answer. Some might say Confederation is the start, since after Confederation, Canada pretty much ran its domestic affairs by itself. Some will say 1931 was the year Canada became independent, because Canada got more independence than foreign policy. There are some that might say 1982 was the year Canada became independent, and I wouldn't really be shocked if in some very hardcore Republican circles, you can still find people saying Canada isn't independent, because Canada still has the British King as its official ruler. Although the king pretty much has no power, and even the Governor-General, the person that is supposed to be the king's representative, has more ceremonial power. The current Governor-General is Mary Simon. Simon is notable for being the first Indigenous woman to become the Governor-General. There is also apparently some small controversy that she can't speak French, although she is apparently trying to learn French. Canada's political power rests with the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who also was the son of former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Trudeau is a liberal and came into office with the promise of progressive social policy and fighting against climate change. Trudeau, when he first came into office, was quite popular and was really a media darling. However, as the years have gone by, he has become less popular for a variety of reasons. Some of the big complaints are accusations that he is a virtue signaler on social issues, he let corruption happen, and/or he just is incompetent at the job. In the last two federal elections, Trudeau actually lost the popular vote, only winning the most seats due to Liberal voters being more concentrated in important swing constituencies. That being said, Trudeau still has plenty of supporters. It's unlikely Trudeau will disappear tomorrow, And at the very least, Trudeau has played a role in the development and political history of Canada. While some of this opposition has come from the more traditional movements of the Conservatives and the NDP, there's a growing number of anti-establishment movements that are rising in popularity. As stated previously, Quebec nationalists are quite powerful in Quebec, although it to a certain extent depends on the organization promoting it, and debatably, you could argue they aren't really that anti-establishment anymore. There is the Green Party, which promotes a very environmentalist and left-wing populist message, and then there is also the People's Party, which promotes a very right-wing populist message. There also have been a growing number of people from Western provinces, particularly Alberta, who feel their voices aren't heard by the federal government. A small independence movement has sprung up and did contest the 2021 election. Admittedly, Western separatists, the Greens, and the People's Party combined just got a little over 7% of the vote in the 2021 election, and they have relatively few lawmakers in office. However, their existence does show that there is a growing number of people who are upset with the status quo, and are turning to non-traditional parties and movements to voice their frustrations. These movements might die out and become a footnote, but they will still likely have some impact. So why does Canada exist? Canada, as we know it today, exists because of the end result of the 7 Years' War. The British taking Canada and then holding it during both the American Revolution and the War of 1812 is what allowed Canada to develop and grow. I'd also argue that the failure of the 1837 rebellions also shaped how the country developed, as instead of embracing republicanism, it remained a British colony. The relationship between both the Anglophone and Francophone communities also greatly shaped how Canada would transform itself over the years, from just a collection of colonies into the second largest country in the world today. While I try to touch up on many different aspects of Canadian history, I know I missed out on quite a few, but I still hope I was able to do a good job summarizing Canada's history. Up next, we will go to Cape Verde, prepare for only 500 years of human settlement, the Portuguese, and my embarrassing attempt to bake. Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed. So yeah, there was a lot I missed in this episode. I really would have liked... There's a lot of really interesting things about Canada that I would love to go deeper into. I know the rebellions of 1837, Louis Riel, the Ochre Crisis, the Fenian invasions are probably some of the most interesting stuff that I know. And then also one interesting connection that I kind of thought of as I was about to record this. Canada's history is also similar to Cameroon in the sense that both Canada and Cameroon had a sort of independence war, but in both cases, the pro-independence faction lost, and yet it still became independent. Canada with the rebellions of 1837, and then Cameroon with the UPC rebellion. So yeah, I didn't realize this while I was writing it, but now that I'm saying it out loud, it's actually really interesting. But yeah, I'm not going to talk about Canada for a while. I think that's okay. I'm a little Canada'd out. I actually thought about going up to Canada to record this, but I have a job, so I'm not going to drive 2 hours to go to Canada and then record for 2 hours and then drive back. That's a little crazy. But yeah, up next we will talk about Polish political parties, and then I'll talk about Japanese political parties, and then I'll do the history of Cape Verde. No idea when those are going to come out. They'll come out when they come out. But yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you want, you can email me at whydocountriesexist@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.